Good afternoon, everyone, and a very good morning to those joining us from European time zones. This is the inaugural event in our SG Declares and Shares series, and we have three prolific speakers in Nirmal, Ben, and Han. Razvan is tasked with moderating this session of the Environmental Heavyweights. Thank you, Razvan, for accepting the challenge. The Construction Declares movement is now almost exactly 1 year old. It now has about 5,500 architectural firms, engineering consultancies, and other construction and design industry professional firms in its ranks. This probably adds up to about 500,000 like-minded professionals working in these firms across 25 countries. The movement is still in its infancy, and like any other infant, it continues to grow by the day. Singapore was the first Asian country to join the movement back in January 2020, and more recently, the first country anywhere with environmental consultants joining the movement, which makes us by default the international administrators of the Environmental Consultants Declare. Without further ado, allow me to pass the session to Razvan to introduce our speakers and to get the session going. Hope you will have a good and fruitful hour ahead. Just a brief introduction on Razvan for those who may not know him. He is an architect at Hassell and the features editor of the Singapore Architect magazine. Over to you, Razvan.
Thank you to all of you joining us today. And to maintain online decorum, your microphones will not be active for the duration of our session. However, we are very keen to hear from you during the Q&A channel. So type your questions anytime as we go into the Q&A box, and we'll try our best to get to as many as we can. To our three guests, your work speaks volumes. So your challenge will be to capture all of that between 6 to 8 minutes, so you can leave enough room at the end for questions and conversations. But enough of me. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome Zahan. Han is the chairman of sustainability and a council member at the Singapore Institute of Architects, as well as an EXCO board member of the Singapore Green Building Council. Take it away, Han.
Thank you, Razvan. Sorry, did you say 6 to 8 minutes or 68 minutes? Because that makes a bit of difference.
6 to 8.
Okay. Just bought a bit of time
and
there.
Don't forget, I have the mute button power, so I'll ensure it's 8.
That is true. All right, so you should be seeing the screen now. First of all, thank you so much, Hossein and Construction Declares for the invitation. In the next 5.5 minutes, I will be sharing on the 7 environmental design guidelines that the Sustainability Committee at the Singapore Institute of Architects have formulated over the course of the past 2 years. I'm delighted to have with me, of course, Ben Towell, who's been a stalwart in the committee, and the results of which were actually authored into the SIA Green Book. We also have in the attendees amongst us, Sunny Chond, who is the deputy chair of the committee, and Kwan Chi Yong, architect Kwan, who is the advisor for the committee. Here we go. So what is happening on Earth, or what on Earth is happening? We started 2019 being woke about the plastic problem, and all sorts of discussions came about on circularity and what we need to do with our waste problem. And then we were confronted with massive fires, both of an Amazonian and an Australian nature. We closed out the year with a bit of hope as to what 2020 would bring with COP25, which was originally meant to be in Chile, but because of social unrest, another a city eventually hosted the event. And of course, that was Madrid. Sad to say, because of certain policies by certain superpowers, we didn't exactly see much change being ratified in COP25. So on to 2020 then, right, with the hope that COP26, or what was meant to be COP26 in Glasgow, would bring us better change. And then we were hit by COVID, right? So what lies ahead really is Decision 2020, not referring to the Singapore GE, which has come and gone, but really the American elections, the US elections, which would really, I think, to a large extent decide the fate of the planet as well. And the analogy between COVID-19 and climate change is precise because everyone's sort of aware of the problem, right? But the solutions are hard to come by because of so many things that stymie the progress, for example, of testing, of prevention, and ultimately of vaccination as well. Yep. And a couple of months ago, when the whole world was pretty much in lockdown, carbon emissions did see a fall, but I think it's on its way up again now that the world is reopening. So you've heard obviously about flattening the curve. You've heard about the hammer and the dance, and how the lockdowns have to some extent reduced at least the first wave of spread for COVID-19. Could we implement this for climate action when it's much more of a slow burn than COVID? So if you look at this, the planetary boundaries model, climate change is only one of 9 different sectors which we're facing, or in which we're facing uncertainty. And if you look at biosphere integrity and biogeochemical flows, that's towards the region of uncertainty. And by the time it gets unknown, that spells disaster for the planet. So we have economists like Kate Raworth, who basically posits the donut economy model, where if we can sustain our life and our economy within the 2 bands of the ecological ceiling and the social foundation, growth could actually be defined as cycles within that green safe zone, which therefore defines the donut. Ben will share a bit more about this, but the 17 UN SDGs were formulated in 2015, right, with the goal, of course, of a more equitable and sustainable future. Now, as members in the construction industry, I suppose it's a bit of a far reach for us to solve all 17, right? For instance, reduce inequalities, gender equality, no hunger, right? These are things that might be beyond our reach. So what we decided to do as the Singapore Institute of Architects is to have a look at these 7 environmental design goals. Each of them are combinations of several of the UN SDGs, well, the ones that we do have a mode of control over anyways, right? So the next slides will show the 7 plus some examples, the first of which is education and integration. So basically construction, declaring and taking the lead in the environmental equation. So some of the measurables in educating and integrating the industry as well as our consumers would be the use of BIM, VDC, IDD, all those other alphabets you hear in the industry, early contractor involvement, early FM involvement, and things like that. So the Green Book, which Ben of course will share about, is something we released a couple of months ago, currently in a digital form. So this will guide us as to how architects and ultimately the construction industry can actually practice more sustainably. An example of a project as well, a laboratory which basically guides the measurement and the setting of parameters for building technologies, which could then ultimately be coded into building codes and practices as well. EDG number 2, climate action, basically looking at modes of actually operating in a more, sustainable manner with regard to climate change. So the measurables would include operational carbon, life cycle assessment, as well as pollution. And that could be measured either in ozone depletion potential, a global warming potential, NOx, SOx, and so on. So of course, in a master plan, before it even gets to a building, we have then the opportunity to set certain climate goals, right? Whether it's water savings, energy savings, and of course, also in the passive design of buildings, where we determine how far buildings can be from one another, right? And the aspect ratios in which they could ideally be as well. Natural capital, that basically describes the preservation of wildlife and what effectively is nature, and that could be measured by a biocapacity. And when it comes to greens, green plot ratio, lush, the LUSH figure, a leaf area index, as well as, of course, landscape replacement. This is almost the poster child of green projects. So effectively with a green plot ratio, you would see skyrise greenery as well. Resource management, how well we basically consume and then recycle and put our waste back into the loop. This has gained a bit more of a new life with the Resource Sustainability Act that was passed in Parliament last year in Singapore. So basically creating architecture and creating buildings with very conscious choices of the materials that we use, and the measurables, of course, would be energy, water, and materials. An example is a project in Taipei that has constructed an exhibition space that's made out of 1.5 million recycled water bottles. Urban harmony, I think this would be architecture 101 or urban planning 101 for many of us in this room. Basically looking at how the new developments can coexist with existing infrastructure. So the measurables would be connectivity, placemaking, and also the urban heat island effect. This is a public housing project by WOHA that demonstrates some of these values, and that includes creating possibilities of chance encounters by internal public areas as well as well-ventilated spaces. Close to the end now, health and well-being, looking at how buildings can promote, well, physical as well as psychological health. A hospital project would be an example where each ward gets visual and also physical access to gardens and greens. And finally, adaptability and longevity, where buildings should be designed for the long run, right? So a design for maintainability being one of the measurables again. So a case of a project where the existing structure was kept, 2 floors were added and completely recladded in what is now a brand new, well, almost a brand new building. So one of the thought exercises we did with the committee as well was to look at what the modular green building or what the model green building would be in response to COVID. So you have flexible spaces, rooftop spaces for food resilience, and again, a mode of expandability, right? And these adopt the 7 EDGs. It's a thought exercise. So the EDGs come in really by mapping the relevant environmental design goal, with the architects declare signatories, or rather what the architects declare signatories intend to do, right? So these deck of slides will be shared. I won't go through all of it, but the idea is to peg a measurable and a way of actually targeting what each of these declarations could actually do, right? And that again maps back to the 7 EDGs. So what we can do next is basically identifying targets, determining what kind of values and what kind of measurables we would peg each project on. And that could be extended to digital tools, which could be online or plugins to your existing design and construction tools. And finally, mapping of the EDGs versus where we are in the industry and where we would like to be. So in closing, do remember to wash your hands. But again, we are concerned about the second wave of COVID and the third wave, but the bigger waves do lie ahead, right? So we're facing a recession, facing climate change, and hopefully not a biodiversity collapse. So thank you.
Okay, on that happy note, thank you so much for that, Han. To continue, I will pass the mic to Ben. Benjamin is an architect, chartered surveyor, chartered environmentalist, and co-author of the SIA Green Book. I look forward to hearing your presentation next. And you'll see my face in exactly 7 minutes.
Thanks for that. Okay, everyone. So, right. So the SIA Green Book, really the essence of this book is that it frames a direct response to the deep socio-ecological crisis of the Anthropocene age. And I will change, there we go. And it positions the built environment professions, particularly architects, as ones which are aware and engaged with the UN SDGs, the New Urban Agenda, as well as part of the international environmental law and changes in the finance scene. So it also helps us to articulate our position, our value better, and that highlight that we are the solution providers for the built environment's contribution to climate change, and that we have an opportunity to positively intervene in this process. The first part of the book, in reality, is probably the most important, as it deals with the professional response and the practical application. And this is where the EDGs actually sit. So it's kind of a call for action that we must adopt a radically different paradigm in the Anthropocene age to really address the challenges and the changes of the climate, to live up to our professional responsibilities that we have as custodians of the built environment. Han has shared the EDGs in brief, but these really form that means of contextualizing and articulating that response to those global drivers. These are the 7 environmental design guidelines. If you want to find out more, please do download the book. It is free of charge. There's a plug. But there it really talks about how you can implement all of those into projects, into practice, at the neighborhood scale, at the building scale. And implicit in these is the multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, whole of life perspective, which relates to the complexities of how our built environment is conceptualized all the way through to its end of life. This also links to construction declares quite nicely. Han showed how we've mapped them. So it really allows you to translate those commitments into really meaningful actions today, as we all have the responsibility to act with seriousness and swiftly to honor those commitments that have been made. Now, the second part of the book, although it's the context, has been placed after all the bits that you can do. And it really is quite an interesting part of the book for me, because it sets the scene and goes into other aspects of environmental law and bits which sometimes we skim through as built environment professionals, but actually impact us directly in our day-to-day work, although we may not realize it. Now, of course, the first part is climate change, or as I like to phrase it, just how screwed are we? Well, it's a bit scary, actually, that today, based on the agreements under the commitments under the Paris Agreement, we're still heading to a 4-degree world. Now, what does this mean? Well, it kind of means catastrophic biodiversity collapse, climate change. And from a finance point of view, leading finance institutes have said a 4-degree world is uninsurable. In terms of the global action that's actually needed, we're looking at a 55% reduction in carbon emissions from 2010 levels. Now, Hannah's already painted the context of COVID, that actually with all this economic pain, with all the disruption to travel globally, you would think that, okay, we would have made a dent into that emissions reduction, but actually no. We're looking at between a 4 and 7% reduction from 2019 levels, which of course was a record level. We haven't even hit the 2010 levels of carbon emissions, even with COVID. So you can see it's going to be an absolutely mammoth task to even make a dent into reaching the 1.5 degree target by 2050. And we're already at 1 degree now. But it's not an evenly distributed thing. If you look at Southeast Asia in particular, we're looking at heading for a +8 degree climate, and that means food yields will be down by about 50%, which places even greater pressure on the limited amount of natural habitats that we have left. That plus a growing population, you can see where that's heading towards. So we really do need to start thinking about how do we act convincingly now. The book relates a lot of this back to the built environment. So it's not all about these are the issues, but also how does this impact the built environment? What role does the built environment play? So of course, well, let you read that for yourselves. The next part looks at international environmental law. So obviously we touch on the Paris Agreement, which everyone likes to cite, but no one really knows what's in there. So the Green Book kind of provides that little bit of context there. And it also goes into one of the key aspects that I see, which is it does give a mechanism to legally address losses and damages associated for the adverse effects of climate change. And in fact, climate change litigation is increasing dramatically, and more cases are being won where there has been evidence of, or even risk of climate or environmental damage. So the law has started to favor the environmental side. So what kind of issue or responsibility does this play on us as built environment professionals, especially when it comes to infrastructure projects, for example? On the back of this, the UN Global Pact, which is probably the most daring environmental pact or legal mechanism that's been postulated or put forward ever. And it's a WTO, or World Trade Organization moment for the environmental sector. And the key aspect of this is that every person has the right to live in an ecologically sound world. So it's the first time that it actually puts environmental conditions or ecologically sound world as a human right. So the work that we do as professionals directly impact the rights of people, should this be ratified. Now, the third part of the book is probably it was the most fun to write. And it provides that critique of everything that's in the book, the frameworks that we've touched on, the EDGs, and things like that. And first of all, it kind of recognizes that actually, let's take a step back from patting ourselves on the back, saying we've done a great job with our many awards that we've won. But actually, what we do most of the time is complicit in sustaining the multiple drivers of Earth system destruction. And we really haven't, as a professional group in the built environment, anywhere in the world, have been sufficiently ambitious to deal with these issues of destructive modes of urbanization and the damages of our current mode of economic growth. And rightly, this is now coming under increasing scrutiny, and it will continue to do so. So we really do need to start to move on this convincingly. The other part of it, which I thought to put in here, is whilst we agree that we should be working within and contextualizing the UN SDGs, and they're very important, but in reality, are they actually unsustainable development goals because they are used to legitimize that human-centric development and continue that kind of trajectory of socio-economic development as it's defined today, which is usually to the expense of the Earth system integrity. So no book would be complete without a conclusion. So the picture here is showing what is purposeful. It's kind of really emphasizes why this is what we must do. We must have a professional stand. We cannot preserve the status quo. If we do, we need to really be comfortable with the fact and accept the responsibility that comes with the decision that we are preserving the root causes of this socio-ecological crisis. And even though it's a book, words alone cannot change behavior. We're all aware of that, but better words can prompt better behavior for us to start to address these systemic challenges that lie ahead of us. So I really hope that we all get on board, download the book and start implementing it in practice. And those of you who are signatories to Construction Declares, use that to actually start meeting those commitments. So that's all from me, Razvan.
Great, thanks, Ben. And congrats once again to both you and Han for this remarkable achievement. And to round out the presentations today, it is my pleasure to also introduce Dr. Kishnani. Nirmal is an educator and researcher with the School of Design and Environment at NUS, and an author of several books that question sustainability in the context of Asia. I see your slideshow is up, so over to you.
Great, thank you, Razvan. Let me start with a provocation, and after listening to Han and Ben, maybe it's not such a big provocation. I don't believe green buildings do enough, not even the ones that are rated platinum. The collective impact of voluntary green certification in Asia has been marginal at best. And this is not for a lack of goodwill. It has a lot to do with the way a green building is defined, that disconnects it from what is happening at the scale of the city. So we've become programmed to thinking about occupant and owner, site and shell. This, I believe, is a glass ceiling. Let me start with an example of what's been happening in Asia with the city of Mumbai over the past 2 to 3 decades. Now, we've seen widening social inequity. The city had 6.25 million living in slums in 2001. By 2017, that figure was 9 million, or 62% of the metropolitan population. Much of this is due to migration of populations from countryside to city, drawn to jobs and wealth. A lot of what was happening socially was mirrored in land use. Mumbai lost 36% of forest cover, 31% of wetlands, 40% of open space and cropland. The blue networks of the city were not spared either. Freshwater lakes shrank by 23%, water bodies in urban areas by 12%. The entire hydrological network of the city was severely compromised, resulting in annual floods. The worst of these floods took place in 2005, when over 1,500 people died and some 200,000 homes and commercial properties were damaged. Now, despite all this, Mumbai is the greenest city in India. Why? Well, because it has 750 green certified buildings, more than any other city in the country. So looking back, I think it's useful to remind ourselves that green has always been an argument to do less harm by mitigating consumption in ways that improving occupant comfort and health. There is now an emerging generation of what we call deep green buildings that aspire to minimal impact, so zero energy or salutogenic design that actively promotes wellness. But looking at Mumbai, I would argue that even deep green is not enough. We need to actively repair and regenerate. I became very interested in this idea of regenerative thinking in the context of Asia and began to look for examples, not only buildings, but also parks and neighborhoods. So here are a few examples of what I found. Yanweizhou Park in Jinhua City in China is by Tourandscape. It is built on a site that was once a brownfield contaminated land. It now acts as a sponge for the city, drawing water to itself to mitigate the risk of floods elsewhere. And so despite the occasional flood, it maintains public space and pedestrian connectivity. This is the Pasupati flyover in the city of Bandung in Indonesia. Under the stewardship of the then mayor, Ridwan Kamil, who by the way is an architect and planner, this dead space was converted into a park. It is now a thriving community space that defragments the neighborhood that was once divided by the road. This is the Kaohsiung National Stadium in Taiwan by Toyo Ito. I think it's remarkable because it mitigates flood in the neighborhood by drawing water, storm water into its ponds. It offers 24/7 public space. It is a biodiversity habitat that acts as a stepping stone for the movement of fauna. The roof is a solar PV installation, one of the largest single building installations in the world that generates 1,140 megawatt hours per year. When the stadium is not in use, this energy demand meets the neighborhood by 80%. This is Kampong Admiralty in Singapore by Woha Architects. Like the Kaohsiung Stadium, it is a nexus for water flows, greenery, and public space. All of this while it fulfills the program of a community building with housing for the elderly. A recent biodiversity audit found that the roof has more birds, insects, and small animals than pocket parks nearby. Now, these and other projects were compiled into my book, Ecopuncture. And what's interesting is that some of these projects were publicly funded, like the ones that I showed you, but others were private commercial developments. But all of them set out to do more than just less harm. They set out to do good. Now, the question here, of course, is not just, is this a good idea, but how do we replicate it? There must be a basis for adoption and replication. In the postgraduate program that I teach, I work with Wong Man Sam from Woha to investigate this idea of replication. The question we ask our students as a hypothetical is, what will a resilient Singapore in 2050 look like? What if every building were designed in some way to be net positive? So each student gets to pick a building in the city and redesign it. They have to keep the brief the same, but introduce systems and technologies and services that generate a surplus. So here is a sampling of the buildings that the students redesigned, showing how energy becomes a driver for form making. Here is what, extrapolating this to Singapore, what the island would look like if all buildings did the same. And here is how elements of infrastructure, our roads, our MRT lines, our MRT depots, the container port, what if all of these began to participate in the production of energy? The same question was asked of food and water as two resource systems generated integrated into the buildings, and of green cover and public space as urban ecological systems. And this is what they found. As they extrapolated findings from a sample size of buildings to the larger building stock, they found that there is the possibility that Singapore could become energy self-sufficient. Water self-sufficiency, in theory, would be even easier to achieve. We could reduce our dependence on desalination and new water plants. With widespread urban farming and a low meat diet, we could be food self-sufficient. The amount of public space would double, as would the amount of green cover. So the question we are left with is, why not do this? And the answer, as what we saw in Mumbai, is that we see the building and the urban scales as being two largely independent exercises. We see private profit and public good as two different goals. This, I think, is the glass ceiling of the green building movement and one of many obstacles to sustainability and urban resilience. Okay, back to you. That's all for me.
Great, thank you very, very much. It's been great to hear from all of you. We already have some questions in. And while we continue with our conversation, please do submit all your other questions. My first, we're missing one. Han, are you still around?
Yep.
There you are. I think to break the ice, I was really curious to hear from each of you what sparked the initiative of writing your books. Shall we start with you, Han?
Yeah, sure. So the SIA Green Book was really born out of the need to sort of incorporate sustainability guidelines into practice. Now that's already being done by virtue of there being a green mark or LEED or what have you, depending on which rating you might be going for. But as an official stance from the Institute of Architects, we've got the Blue Book, which talks about the means of hiring an architect, when you actually get paid for all your services and so on. And insofar, we haven't actually mapped sustainability processes onto the workflow of the architect. So the book was meant to introduce how in the entire flow chart, or in the entire flow from concept all the way to operations of the building, one could actually incorporate sustainability principles. And that's how the EDGs were born. So the next step for this really would be to map into the architect's mode of work, or the architect's, I suppose, payment schedule as well, how sustainability could come in, right, and which EDGs would therefore be relevant. Of course, as you've seen in the past half an hour, it's taken a bit of a life of its own, and it now sets out to do a lot more than what it intended to do in the first place.
That's great. How about you, Nirmal?
I wrote a book in 2012 called Greening Asia, that looked at new principles of sustainable development at the scale of the building. And I think after some time had passed and I looked back at the projects of the book and some of the arguments that I was making about the scale of thinking, I realized that a couple of projects stood out that went beyond the idea of a better building. And one of them was the Khoo Teck Puat Hospital, which I'm a big admirer of. And what the Khoo Teck Puat succeeded to do was to transform the neighborhood. It had these ripples of goodness, shall we say, emanating from its site. It went beyond site. I mean, it's a hospital, it's a fairly complex building, but what it achieved went beyond healthcare. It began to transform the way we see wellness. And I grew interested in this idea of regenerative net positive buildings. And I asked the question if there are more examples of this in Asia. And that's how the book began. It was a search for Khoo Teck Puats in Asia to look at where these projects were found, but more importantly, why they were doing it.
That's interesting, because it kind of leads to my next question, which, I mean, obviously all three of you are experts in your field, yet, the end of a journey is never probably what you expect in the very beginning. And I'm curious to find out whether you had any sort of aha discovery moment along the way that you might not have foreseen at the outset.
Okay, I guess I'll jump in on this one with the Green Book. So, I mean, the writing event, I mean, it's pretty unfair to say the Green Book is a book when you compare it to Ecopuncture, because the size is, versus. But, as with writing anything, be it a short paper, a long book, it's kind of a roller coaster when you're doing it. It was really disheartening when you're looking at especially the climate change section of it. Looking at the Keeling curve and doing the actual calculations on the year-on-year increase in carbon emissions. And when you realize the IPCC documents are actually out of date in terms of their timeline of action, and actually our window of action is a lot smaller. We're looking at less than 8 years before we go past 1.5 5 degrees Celsius from when we started writing it. So that's 6 years, 7 years from now. So that was horrific. But then there was little glimpses of we're not in it alone. And when you start looking at the other professions, like the legal profession, and especially in the environmental law sector, a lot of the words that they were using, and you can see in the book that we've credited Professor Lewis Coates, who was part of the team drafting the UN Global Pact, the language that they use is very similar to the language that we use when we talk about the subject, and they have the same kind of ideas. So it's kind of, we're all in our various pockets, and if there's a way that we can all come together, all the different professions, then that provides a real glimmer of hope. And that's something which I hope that through the Green Book, architects, engineers can look at that and feel their way through those kind of principles of environmental law, see what's going on, and how we as a profession can work together to provide those solutions on the scale that we need to.
And it's great that you do bring up law, because I guess the way we talk about something, and it's something that I think that really resonated in what you said, which is words prompt action, because they hit a chord, hopefully. But do you, and this is a question to all of you that came from the audience, do you see a disconnect between the science and the politics of environment?
Yeah, one of the things with, especially with systemic legal changes, I mean, they don't come from economics. They don't come from necessarily science. It tends to be from public movements, which is backed by science. Science is always debated. In fact, that's how, especially if we look at other countries' legal systems, you know, they have such difficulty implementing their statutes, because you don't argue at the statute level, you argue at the regulatory level, because you will argue on the science of it. So how sure are you in the courts that this, you know, there is no doubt, therefore this pollution is causing harm or something like that. So when you look at how major statutes globally have come in and said, look, you have a right, the polluter no longer has the right to pollute. So we're going to assume it's dangerous and you have to prove it does no harm, rather than the other way around, has always come from a social movement. It's never come directly from pure science or from an economic point of view, because quite often, you know, the economics don't work out, because it doesn't take into the whole life, the next generation after, which is why
right.
A lot of things.
As an advocate, I'm curious, Sahan, you've been speaking and living it for so long. What's your view on that question?
I think science really is a function of its patronage, and I think legal frameworks around the world, or even in cross-national NGOs, they exist, I think, to either support or debunk science in many ways. So a lot of the research that currently is happening only exists because certain governments are pushing for it. And short of these sort of, I think, foundations, right? Science, in the way we look at it, it doesn't exist, because the validity of science, therefore, is through how well it's published, how well it's received, how much additional funding you can get, right? You might draw a parallel with academia in that sense.
And I do want to draw that parallel, more like an arrow, to ask Nirmal to contribute with some of his experience in actually researching some of it. And I assume that everything that's being researched is meant to be implemented. Do you see a continuation or a disconnect or a growth in the appetite of how the actual kind of industry, for lack of a better term, is starting to adopt some of the ideas that you're researching and developing in school?
Yeah, I think there is a tendency to discuss this, to shape the conversation around ideas of economic capital. And one of the things that surprised me about the projects that I found is that while the idea of profit and economic dividend was present in all of them, it was not the only capital that was being discussed. Mm-hmm. Even in projects that were commercially driven, that were profit-seeking, there was almost a perceived exchange rate between capitals, that you could, for instance, generate natural capital, and that would eventually have a dividend of economic capital, or that you could generate human or social capital, and that would have a knock-on effect on something else. Mm-hmm. So there is this, shall we say, a science of capitals emerging. There is a conversation right now on how these different descriptors of wealth fit into a larger scheme of things. And I think when we develop this idea a bit more, we'll become much more deft and sophisticated in the way that we have these conversations. Because right now, I think we're backed into a corner. You know, what's the payback? What's the profit on this? What's the, you know, it's a conversation that's a dead end because it always has a short-term perspective. But the minute you start to look at social, human, even symbolic capital, you know, the idea that it improves brand and reputation, these things matter a lot. I was quite surprised to find that about the spectrum of projects that I was studying, that it was not limited to the idea of economic capital.
And it's interesting because it really addresses, and I think starting to tease out some of the ideas that one of the questions asked, which is what role would the government agencies have to play in the next 5 years to push the industry forward? And now I'm reading real hardcore policy. And the question also asks, surely developers need to be held accountable somehow, but let's focus less on the sum and more on the how. Curious to hear your thoughts on that, Ben.
Yeah, okay. First of all, I have to make the announcement that anything that I say here is represented in my personal opinion and not of my employer, which happens to be one of those agencies.
Yeah. You can also choose to, if you're uncomfortable answering.
No, I'm comfortable to answer, but I just need to make that perfectly clear because there has been some good moves in that space by Singapore agencies. I would argue not enough, but that's what I'm in a certain group to argue that it's not enough and push it further. But yeah, you're right. There really needs to be a holistic kind of positive approach that is based on accountability. At the end of the day, we have a way that developers are, some of them very progressive and very useful, very helpful, but you know, the architect, the engineer ends up taking certain responsibilities, although we know that the paymaster should have the overall accountability. So there needs to be an addressing of that accountability, number one. Number two, it is regulations need to step up. You know, we need to stop looking at regulations as the bare minimum that it's okay, it will do, we got to protect the industry. No, the regulations need to be stepping right up as far as it is reasonably practical. And that doesn't, and if it's a regulation, that doesn't mean there's a additional cost because it becomes the baseline. So there needs to be a real stepping up of that. And there is something in the pipeline with the Green Building Master Plan to kind of do that. But is it enough? I leave that to you guys to say no and hopefully push harder for a greater level of holistic policy that isn't just energy based as well.
And I think, I mean, to balance also the question, maybe Sahan, you can give us your view on that.
I think one of the ways to look at both the two recent questions, policy versus politics versus science, and policy versus best practices, is to observe the shenanigans or the relationship between Donald Trump and Anthony Fauci, where what is presumed to be clear hard evidence or scientific evidence is denied and is basically just brushed aside, right? So, and then if your policies start taking on that sort of complexion, right, then there's no way to basically say science influences policy or best practices are really for the benefit of people, right? Because the question of what's beneficial in this case is, of course, extremely diverse, right? What's beneficial for health may not, of course, be beneficial for, in this case, trade and economics. So I think we exist in a nice little microcosm of the world in Singapore, where I think the effects of policy are fairly obvious, right? But so too, I think the engagement of professionals, again, wearing the SIA hat through trade associations, as well as through various task forces that are currently happening with the new Green Building Master Plan. So it wouldn't be as if we're voiceless, or it wouldn't be as if we're just slaves to, sorry, that's a poor word to use these days, but we're just, I think, reacting to policies that that come about, I think. So, well, again, I think more needs to be done. I think why the book also exists is to, I think, represent a voice and to encapsulate, I think, a mode of thought that, hey, you know, while we respect and we abide by, in this case, the recommendations of Greenmark, these too are our ways of recommending best practices, in this case, for architecture.
And I think, I mean, I think all three presentations have really managed to address the fact that we are at a very specific juncture in kind of time, place, and global affairs. But at the same time, I think the next question really hits home on a number of levels because, and I'm going to read it out, as the political frame of reference shifts from globalization to nationalization, who will deliver change? How will this be coordinated? And what I would add to it is a recent webinar I attended, delivered by Lynn Liu, the director of the Princeton Ellinger Center for Energy and the Environment, where she was addressing this climate change as a very holistic, almost like planetary scale effort that, you know, all the good buildings that we all hope to design, however net zero energy they are, unless sort of the geopolitics do enable that conversation to happen, it's all unfortunately not going down the right path. So, you know, framing that globalization versus nationalization, perhaps start with Dr. Nirmal on that one.
Yeah, I think if there's anything we've learned of late is that we can't rely on global supply chains the way we used to. I mean, the discussion on self-sufficiency, for example, was always kind of a bit tenuous in the Singapore context. You know, we were prepared to go some ways with water, but, you know, halfway with energy, and food was like 30%. I think it's changed the dynamic of this discussion quite a lot. Because there is a real, it's kind of brought home the idea that we really do live in a globalized world that is full of risks, and there has to be a certain level of autonomy that takes place within the city. I think the lead-on point about that is that the study that we did with our students, which showed how, well, if you kind of engage the city in more productive ways, what that could mean. Well, let's do the sums on that. You know, I'm hoping somebody out there is listening and is prepared to do the sums on that, which is to say, if we could get every building in Singapore to recycle its water, we could do away with how many desalination plants? You know, it's a spreadsheet of money, right? It's about taking from this pocket and that pocket. If a developer is not, if it's not in the interest, the short-term interest of a developer who's seeking profit to do things that are good for the city, then, well, maybe they need to be subsidized. Maybe they need to have taxpayer money going into doing things that are necessary for the city. So I think the glass ceiling of this discussion is the idea that this is going to be born of goodwill, or you're going to force people to do it. I think those two, the dichotomy of this thing is not very helpful. That, you know, either the developer for ethical reasons or self-interest is just going to go out there and build these amazing zero carbon buildings. You know, there is a trade-off. There is a conversation that takes place between one scale and another. And if it could be demonstrated that every building in Singapore recycling water or produces a certain amount of food or integrating water recycling reduces the demand and improves the security at the city scale, then let's have this conversation in a different way. You know, there are things that you can regulate. There are things that water, for example, has a payback of very short payback of less than 10 years. And maybe that should become regulatory. You know, that should be mandated. But farming does not. Farming will never, at the current prices, be profitable if you put it in an office building in downtown Singapore. That would never make sense. So that conversation requires a different kind of way of thinking about money, of how do we create the incentive structure that allows these things to happen across the city.
Oh, those are great points. I saw you nodding quite a few times, Ben. Would you like to respond or add, or simply agree?
I think it's right. I think we always have this kind of, well, regulate and I'll do it, or pay me as an incentive and I'll consider it. And I think that kind of overall value that we miss, if we take cheap disposable plastics as an example, all of us as a population are paying for the cost of that disposal, not the producer. So it's a fool's economy in many ways. That, you know, while someone's making a massive profit from doing harm, everyone is sharing the costs. And I think it's that kind of sharing, that holistic vision of sharing, the sharing of cost, sharing the burden needs to be considered. And I thought Nirmal's suggestion there just kind of really hit that on the head, that if you aggregate it all up, what is the national benefit and what is the national savings to the public purse, for example? So how are those incentives then passed on? You know, by reducing energy, for example, you reduce the amount of power generators, the national grid infrastructure, which costs a certain amount of money, stormwater, etc. So all of these kind of things need to be seen holistically rather than at that individual building. And at the same time, that individual building needs to be seen how they can then influence that. So it's the macro, micro kind of view which needs to happen, which is a policy issue as well.
Beautifully put. Thank you. Can I just give an example of that? And I think you know, it's not unprecedented. Look at Hong Kong, for example. They had a policy for connectivity at the upper levels, where if a building connected to the next building with above ground linkways and maintained it 24/7, then the developer would be given some kind of extra GFA. It wasn't even a cash handout. It was a kind of a permission to build a little bit more. It was incentivized. What has happened as a result of this policy over time is that you get this labyrinth of passages that connect buildings like in Wan Chai to Central in Hong Kong. It becomes an organic thing, and policy becomes the DNA of a future city. And I think if you can put certain key things in place, the city then over time evolves organically into a state that you want to take it. You don't have to force everyone to do something, but you can incentivize certain actions that create new networks that would benefit all of us.
Those are great points. And I think it's quite interesting because we've been speaking a lot about buildings, cities, systems as objects, but let's bring people back into it. And I think the next question really hits the nail on the head with asking your perspective, and perhaps I can turn the conversation over to Sahan, your perspective on the current well-being certifications for the built environment, such as WELL or FitWell.
I think fundamentally, it is beneficial to occupants if it's focused on the right things. So for instance, WELL looks at indoor environmental quality. It looks at how air is constantly being refreshed and what sort of pollutants you have in your air. It also deals with what I think is more fundamentally psychological in nature, which is visual access to nature and even physical access to gardens and so on within your workspace. So it would be a tough argument to make against these points, right? However, I think if you're taking, as with any green rating, if you're adopting WELL or LEED or Green Mark for the sake of putting a plaque onto your building and then marketing it for a higher yield or rental or sales or something, then obviously that isn't the right priority that's input, right? So I think with everything, including the books that are being discussed in this session, look at it from a first principles point of view and what the actual points being made actually are, right? So it's not about slapping logos onto your building or getting certificates, for the development.
Great, and I'm aware of the time, and I promise to get everyone safe out of here before 5 o'clock. So I think I will ask one last question. It was addressed to Nirmal, but I think we can all address it since we are quite frequently part of NUS and YesUTD and the discussion around academia. The question is, what do you see the role of educators across the board in positively affecting the environmental moment currently underway?
Do you want me to start with that?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think it's evolving, and maybe I could speak from my experience, my personal experience teaching sustainability at undergraduate and postgraduate levels, and we kind of started off by the spaghetti test. The spaghetti test of design, where you kind of throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, and what falls off.
That's how I cook spaghetti.
That's how you cook. But I remember when I joined the university about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we were kind of throwing tools into the studio, and we were kind of looking at knowledge, bringing algorithms and ways of thinking from other disciplines into Studio. Students didn't quite know what to do with that. And it kind of got in the way of design thinking, shall we say, because when you have a very complicated tool and you're supposed to create something, a whole object with it, it's a difficult act of negotiation. What has evolved from that, and in the postgraduate program that I teach now, is that we've adopted a systems approach to teaching, where we teach them to see the built environment as a series of interlocking and overlaid systems, where nature and social space and production, storage, all of these things interact with each other. And when you begin to see things as systems, it's no longer a question of creating objects, but it's a question of creating exchanges. You begin to see buildings and neighborhoods as a set of relationships rather than things that are beautiful. So it goes from being object-centric to relation-centric. I think that's been a big shift for my experience in teaching, from the kind of, well, let's just give them all the tools and see what happens, to a whole other paradigm of understanding the built environment, because that allows you to then look at the interface between the built environment and the natural environment. So it's not limiting to just structure and M&E systems, but it also begins to look at the interface between nature and the built environment. So I think systems thinking is a very useful way to approach this discussion, because it allows us to see things in a dynamic way rather than the creation of static objects in frozen configurations.
Thank you very much. I think that is a great message to end our conversation on. I wanted to thank all three of you again for being such inspiring and eloquent speakers, and also such great conversation buddies. We have Shirin with us, who will round off the discussion today. I would like to thank the audience again for being so engaging and sending all these difficult questions for you guys to have what to debate about. And I look forward to seeing everyone back at the next event.
Thanks, Razvan. Hi, Shirin from MOHA here. Just really a quick closing note. I just want to thank, obviously, all the panelists for your time and your contribution and really interesting discussion. I'd also like to thank Razvan, though, for happily taking on the role of being the moderator here today. Great job. I think that might become a more permanent fixture. Of course, I'd also really like to thank Dr. Hossein and Wan Singh from WEB, who managed to get this first event in our Declares and Share series up and running. We're hoping for this to become a more or less regular thing, maybe an event every other month or so. And for this to really be established as a platform where we can share locally here in Singapore what different people are doing and working on and developing and researching in the context of sustainability in the construction sector. And of course also to then connect back to the larger global organization of the Construction Declares movement. And with that also, obviously, a thank you to all our participants today, all the attendees, many of whom are, of course, signatories of the declaration. And we hope to hear lots of ideas for future events, proposals of, someone who would like to share what they have done, or ideas for speakers going forward. So thanks everyone, and we hope you had a good time here for at the first Declares and Shares event, and we hope for many more of these in the future.
We're only getting started.
That's
Take
right.
care. Bye.